a chance. Welcome everyone to the Calls for Service Subcommittee meeting. We're glad to have all of you here and the members of the public who are on the line. Appreciate you attending and participating as well. So our first order of business, we have some new board members this go round. So we thought it would be great to start off with introductions from everyone. If you could tell everyone, all the board members could let everyone know your name and your affiliation. That would be great. Why don't we start? Edgar, you're on my top left in my video. So why don't we start with you?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Edgar Hampton. I'm the current president of the Anaheim Police Association. I'm also the president and director of the Orange County chapter of PORAC, which is Peace Officers Research Association of California. And I am also one of the executive board directors on PORAC, and that's who I'm representing on this subcommittee now. I'm the PORAC representative.
Great, thanks, Edgar. Steve, you're next in my triangle here.
Afternoon, everybody. Steve Raphael, I'm a professor at UC Berkeley, and I'm the gubernatorial appointee to the committee.
Thanks, Steve. Sheriff, you're next.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Bill Ayoub. I'm the sheriff of Ventura County. I replaced Sheriff John McMahon. This is my first meeting. I am the California State Sheriff's Association representative to the committee.
Great, thank you. Manju, great. Glad you're here.
Yes.
We're just introducing ourselves, so.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Manju Kulkarni. I'm executive director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, known as APCON. We're a coalition of 40 community-based organizations in LA representing the 1.5 million AAPIs. I'm also a co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, and really pleased to be with you. This is obviously my first meeting as well, along with the sheriff, and I was appointed by Speaker Rendon.
Wonderful, thank you all. So we have a full subcommittee. This is a smaller one, which is great. We can really have a full discussion hopefully today, and welcome to our new board members and welcome to your first meeting. And we're excited to dig into some of these topics, so thank you all. So the next order of business is the approval of the March 9th subcommittee minutes, which were sent to all of you. Just as a point of clarification, you don't have to have been present at the meeting in order to vote to approve the minutes, since everyone, did receive them. But we will, obviously, your vote is up to you. So, does anyone want to make a motion to approve?
Yeah, Edgar Hampton, I will make the motion to approve the minutes of the last meeting.
Thank you, Edgar. Anyone have a second?
I'll second.
Great, thank you. So we have 2 votes, and then we don't need to do a roll call vote, but are there other, just for the numbers, Sheriff and Manju, would you vote to approve, abstain, or?
I'd prefer, as I did in the other subcommittee, to abstain unless it prevents the meeting minutes from being passed or approved. So that would be my preference.
I'll vote to approve. Thank you.
Great. Okay, we have a quorum, so the minutes are approved. Thank you. Wonderful. So the next order of business is the election of the subcommittee co-chairs. I know for 2 of you, this is your first or second meeting, your first full meeting. But we would encourage you to self-nominate or nominate somebody else at this time. As far as the duties of the co-chairs, it's really to help facilitate these meetings and review the agendas. And DOJ is happy to support you if you would be interested in co-chairing the subcommittee. So are there any nominations or, any nominations for chair at this time?
Well, I'm reluctant to do so because I'm a co-chair for another one and co-chair of the board, and I feel like others should have a voice, but I'd love to nominate Edgar if he's willing to accept.
And hey, wait a minute. I'm on 4 subcommittees myself, sir. Um, I guess I can do it. I mean, I know I am a full-time release president, so that does help. But I guess if you need somebody to at least work through the agenda and everything else like that, I guess I can do that.
Wonderful. So it sounds like you'll accept the nomination.
I will accept the nomination.
Thank you. Are there
Thank you,
any-
Edgar.
That's Nancy chiming in. Wonderful. Are there any other nominations? Feel free to nominate yourself as well.
I'm happy to be the backup co-chair, but Edgar can't make it.
Thank you, Steve. We appreciate it. We do like to have co-chairs for that reason. So if anyone else would like to, I don't know if that's a nomination to be a co-chair. I know you're already co-chair of the board and co-chair of the Stop Data subcommittee, but if that's a willing nomination to be a co-chair or just a backup at this time. That's why we like to, for those of you who are new, we do like to have co-chairs so that, we can have calls ahead of these meetings and just talk about the agenda and see if there's any issues, or if someone can't make it, the other person can fill in.
I'm happy to nominate myself for co-chair.
Wonderful, thank you. And Steve looks happy with that, so
I am.
great. Thank you, Sheriff. We appreciate that. Steve has many chairing duties right now, including the full board, so we appreciate that, and we will of course support you, as you're with all of this and help walk you through everything. So thank you for that. Any others before we move to a vote? Okay, so we can take a roll call vote on Edgar. First, the nomination for Edgar for co-chair. So Steve moved to nominate Edgar. Edgar accepted the nomination. And go around. So
Do we have a second?
yes, that's what does anyone have a
I
second?
will second.
Okay, thank you, Manju. So we have a second. And Nancy, we do a roll call vote for the co-chairs, correct?
Yes, please.
Okay. So thank you, Manju. Thank you.
I can do it, Allison, if it's
okay.
helpful for you.
Sure, that's great.
Member Kulkarni, how do you vote?
Aye or yes.
Member Raphael?
Yes.
Member Ayub?
Aye for me.
And Member Hampton?
Aye.
Congratulations. You are the new co-chair.
It's congratulations and condolences, right?
No, we will make it as we will make it as painless as possible. So thank you. And then for Sheriff Ayub.
Do we have a second?
I second.
And Member Hampton, how do you vote?
Aye.
Member Ayub?
Aye.
Member Raphael?
Aye.
And Member Kulkarni?
Aye.
And congratulations. We have two co-chairs.
Yay, thank
We're
you, everyone.
so very pleased. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you all very much. And I'm happy to help finish facilitating this meeting. And, then you all will see how the facilitation goes, so you'll be ready for the next meeting. So the next order of business is an overview by DOJ. So I'm going to turn it over to Kendall, who is going to give you all the overview. Thanks, Kendall.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see some of you again and to meet some of you for the first time. So I'm just going to be giving a brief overview of the Calls for Service chapter. My hopes are to get folks caught up to where we're at now and kind of help focus this conversation for kind of visions moving forward. Can everyone see my PowerPoint screen?
Yes.
And you only see the PowerPoint screen, is that correct?
Yes.
Awesome. You always have to double check those notes aren't up. So I'll be going through this PowerPoint presentation with the board, have a few questions for the subcommittee. And then after this, we've set aside about 50 minutes for a board discussion about visions for the report moving forward, and then a time for public comment after the board's discussion. So jumping right in, the first kind of thing I'd like to orient our subcommittee to is where we're at presently or what the report has covered previously. So in the Calls for Service chapter, there are really two focuses of the report, but they're deeply intertwined. And those are, of course, are bias by proxy as well as mental health calls for service. Over the last several years, we've taken a look at bias by proxy. We've started to analyze best practices and policies regarding bias by proxy. We've also began reviewing policies and trainings for dispatchers regarding bias-based calls. And last year, we began our review of a restorative justice approach to bias-based calls for service. Similarly, we started to dive into crisis response and looking at different crisis response models. One of our goals coming into this year was to invite leaders from crisis response organizations to help inform the board of some developing best practices. And actually earlier this year, we had the San Francisco Street Crisis Response team present to the subcommittee and discuss with us some lessons learned in the beginning of their pilot program. We've also begun to review different crisis response models as well as efficacy on the different models. Last year, we took a look at a number of co-responder models. This year, we're taking a look at agencies who are beginning their pilot program, but are moving away from a co-responder model to a more community-based crisis response model. And ultimately, the board is looking at making recommendations aimed at improving crisis intervention throughout California. So this year, and this is in the copy of the report you got, we've started to take a deeper look at bias by proxy with an eye towards dispatcher training. And board members were able to attend the Post-Dispatch Advisory Council meeting facilitated by Virginia Tolmack from Post, who was so kind to host subcommittee members, Officer Edgar Hampton, as well as Dr. Stephen Raphael. In that meeting, there were a number of different things that we learned, including some CAD agencies have predetermined computer programs that are assigned based on a priority, while others are based on penal codes or codes the dispatcher enters. We also learned that depending on agencies' policies, some dispatchers do have the ability to override a priority based on the information solicited from callers. More broadly, we did learn in California there's more than 400 public safety dispatch centers, and they have really struggled with adequate staffing throughout the years. Presently, there's only about 8,000 dispatchers throughout the entire state, and they were responsible for answering nearly 26 million calls for service in 2020 alone. One thing we found surprising as we continue researching and gaining a better understanding of dispatch is there are no uniform policies and procedures that create standards for these centers, such as how calls are prioritized. So one agency may prioritize a suspicious circumstances call entirely differently than another agency would prioritize, for example, a suspicious person call. We are aware that Post is in the process of updating their academy trainings. However, the Post basic training course does not have any anti-bias training, and all that training for dispatchers is presently done in-house or at the agency itself. And actually, a review of the Post workbook for dispatcher training, bias only appears once in that outline. We did learn Post has the ability to create regulations regarding trainings through a vote of the commission. And then, of course, heads of the law enforcement agencies themselves can create policies regarding dispatch. Another issue we've been taking a look at is taking a restorative justice approach to these bias-based calls for service. A restorative justice approach to a bias-based calls for service recognizes the harm that's been caused by a bias caller and is intended to promote healing and justice within affected communities. We did take a look at the New York Commission on Human Rights, and they launched bias response teams in 2016. And these teams respond to bias-based calls for service or a bias-based incident, and they go directly to the community to help support when incidents of bias have occurred and respond directly to the needs of those harmed communities. Another piece of research we found, this was actually through Mental Health in America, is communities should have easily accessible information on alternatives to police services as well, kind of taking that holistic approach to a bias-based call for service. And so zooming out a little bit, I do have some questions for the board moving forward. And I can reiterate these questions as well when we get into the discussion. But curious if the board has any recommendations for Post when updating their dispatcher trainings, such as ways of incorporating anti-bias training. Additionally, if the board may have recommendations for Post in developing dispatch policies or regulations through the commission. And this isn't in the PowerPoint, but this is in the draft of the report. We attempted to create a bias flow chart that is on page 7 of the draft. And curious about the board's feedback on that flow chart and if you think it would be helpful for our community. Moving forward, I'm also curious on the board's kind of vision for future reports and where we see this calls for service chapter heading even next year. For example, a review of the basic training course for dispatchers. Similarly, we had invited, I had mentioned earlier, members from the San Francisco Street Crisis Response Team. So don't know if the board may have an interest in, for example, speaking to someone from the bias response teams from the New York Commission on Human Rights. Additionally, kind of in that same wheelhouse, if the board may be interested in legislative recommendations as well. For example, dispatch being under a different umbrella than Post, for example, just to throw an idea out there. And then another question is maybe ways we could gain a better understanding of the legal requirements and refusing a call for service or declining not to dispatch when a call is based on a bias-based call for service. So as promised, I can reiterate these questions when we begin the discussion, but just a few things to kind of think forwardly about where we see this report heading this year, but also into next year's report. Understanding a lot of the report content has been drafted, so some of this may have to be saved for next year's report. Part of the reason these topics are combined is when we look at crisis response, that is deeply intertwined with dispatch policies and procedures. And so the board has also begun to look at alternatives to crisis response particularly for someone experiencing a mental health crisis that may be an alternative to a police response. Essentially, a health crisis response requires a response from health professionals. And so this year, we've laid out a number of fundamental principles to community-based crisis response. And these principles were developed from SAMHSA, which is the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, as well as from some lessons learned from the crisis response models we've been taking a look at. And so that includes anti-bias training, trauma-informed care, peer intervention, harm reduction, voluntariness, violence-free, a zero suicide aspiration, the least restrictive intervention, as well as short-term and long-term connection to care. We also have begun to take a look at a few developing models, keeping in mind last year we really took a look at some of those co-responder models. So, for example, the COOTS program in Eugene, as well as the Kern County MET program. This year, we're taking a little bit different of a lens, focusing more on community-based crisis response models that are moving towards a model where someone would be dispatched separate from law enforcement. So I mentioned several times the San Francisco Street Crisis Response Team. We did include in this draft the Arizona model, or Crisis Now. I do have to say that is an older model, but it does show how a larger geographic region could be covered. I do have some questions about including that and seeing if maybe a different model should be included instead that is a newer emerging model. I'll ask you that question here in just a moment. And we've also taken a look at the Denver STAR program as well, which began its pilot program last year. We've also taken a look at some cost savings for communities, and across the board, not only are there financial cost savings, but we've also seen reduction in crime rates as well. And so I've included some statistics here that for every 10 additional organizations focusing on crime and community life within a city, it leads to a 9% reduction in the murder rate, a 6% reduction in violent crime, and a 4% reduction in property crime rates. The Healthcare Financial Management Association estimated by providing comprehensive crisis service, we could save as much as $4.6 billion annually. And so similarly to the bias by proxy section, a few things to kind of get the board thinking about for our discussion today. Is there anything here we should be including in the fundamental principles that is not currently included in those principles? For example, prioritizing a non-law enforcement response when there's a suspected health issue at play here. It's commonly referred, or the least restrictive interventions, the language we're using now. But is there a way that could be boldened or wordsmithed in a way that might capture some of those fundamental principles better? Similarly, are there other models for community-based crisis response that we should explore this year? For example, there are a few models out there that are entirely community-based, such as Mental Health First in Sacramento and Oakland. I think it's also beginning a program now in San Leandro. And similarly, I believe in Los Angeles, they have CAT 911, or the Community Action Team, that has also begun their programs as well. So I know I've given everyone a lot of information in a very short period of time. I'm happy to answer any questions, as well as help facilitate the board conversation if folks think that would be helpful as well. And so with that, I can turn it over to the board co-chairs here about discussing this.
I can start off. One of the things addressing the dispatch training, I know it was discussed with that subcommittee meeting we had with Post. I think that's hugely important because that's that link in the chain that everyone seems to forget that all of these calls for service that end up with a police officer going and arriving on scene to a call is began with the dispatch process. So we definitely have to make sure that they're up to date on the training that the officers are getting, and in addition to that, making sure that statewide that there is a standard, that there shouldn't be a different flow chart. So like you showed earlier in Duarte or Calexico than there is in Los Angeles or Sacramento, something like that. So I don't know if that's a funding issue, or I don't know how we would get around that. I know that staffing is very problematic for them, and an additional training means that when a dispatcher is at that training, that they're not sitting at the call center. So I know that that causes problems as well. So I don't know if there's maybe portals that Post can put together that that can be in-service training that someone can sit in front of a computer and do while they're actually at the call centers or something like that. I think that's an option, something that the portal training will allow these dispatchers to be able to attend or participate in the training without having to go off-site for it. So I don't know. Again, I don't know. It's easy for me to say. I'm not the one writing the checks for all that stuff. So, but I do think that's something that we have to address. It can't be that the officers are getting the training and the dispatchers aren't.
I had just a quick response to a few of the things that I read in the draft chapter this morning. I do like the idea of the flow chart and trying to figure out, if there's ways to signal situations where there are signs that perhaps the call is a sort of biased by proxy call. I think we'd have to be careful about what goes into that flow chart and try to, I don't perhaps building it with some of the experience of dispatchers and whatever research exists out there to actually lay out the things that would push people or push the dispatcher to sort of flag the call as potentially biased. I was wondering, and I guess I don't know enough about this topic, and perhaps others on the call do, regarding whether there's a responsibility to respond to every single call. And there's the suggestion in the report of maybe the intervention would be for the dispatcher to communicate their assessment with the officer that's being deployed so they know that it's happening. And I'm thinking, for example, this recent incident that happened, I can't remember where it was, I believe in Michigan, where a father and son were looking at a house with a realtor, and the father and son were African American and the realtor were African American, and a neighbor called the police and everybody ended up in handcuffs. And I think after that incident, the officers were apologetic and they went and scolded the homeowner, but it seemed, I'm trying to think of what would be the process by which the dispatcher would be able to tangibly identify that call as one where the officer should know that it might be a bias call. Okay, that's my comment. And I did have one other comment. We covered a lot in your presentation, Kendall. Thank you. It was very clear. I think at the last subcommittee meeting or over the last few meetings, there have been several interesting kind of logistical issues that were raised. One was the director of emergency management in San Francisco had discussed sort of the need for redundancy in responding to calls. And I wonder if there's any further development. If I remember correctly, what they said they were doing is that they were sending the call out both to officers and the crisis response team, and then whoever got there first dealt with it. So that just seems some sort of logistical issue that we need to think about, I guess, if we're trying to think about policy. And then the other issue that came up, and I like that you went to Arizona to look for an example, was this issue of are San Francisco and San Bernardino a riverside county, or a more rural county with wider geography? Do they require different types of responses when the types of crises that arise won't be so geographically concentrated?
I'd just like to weigh in on the kind of the duty to respond and the dispatcher training piece. I think there is a great deal of overlap between the two, and while there is a sense of a duty to respond to calls for service that do come into the police department, the sheriff's office, or any emergency operations center, the call taker in teasing out the right information from the caller is really what's important, rather than mindlessly accepting a call for service. The idea of thinking about, hey, is this person perhaps viewing the incident with bias, and is that why they're calling? A little deeper dive by our call takers, and very often they're going from call to call to call. But I think that training, and not a one-time training, but repetitive training, micro-learning module, something like that, that's a continuous reminder that, hey, this is in the community in places, and we are going to do our part to try and eliminate it for the betterment of all. So I'm a proponent of seeing enhanced training for our communications operators.
I think explaining that too, the importance of that needs to be done, because ultimately the officer's reaction to what he or she is responding to is a direct result of what that computer screen is saying. So if it says that, hey, there's a burglary in progress, then the officers are responding to a burglary in progress. They're not responding to a realtor showing, potential clients a home. And that does, I say we as a sworn peace officer are held to task for what we're responding to, when that may not necessarily be the case. And I think that gets lost a lot of times as far as, hey, that was an overreaction. Well, it may look like an overreaction because of what the actions the officer took. But then if you look at the call screen, and again, when I worked patrol, one of the things that I got used to doing was showing the people that I interacted with, hey, look, this is what the call for service said. So please understand that's why we're responding in the manner that we're responding, is because this wasn't just, hey, a couple of guys drinking beer in an alleyway. We got a call that there was a crime occurring in this alley, and so our response is going to be a little bit different. And so I think that we need to do a better job of explaining that particular aspect to dispatch and to the public. Like, hey, the officers that are responding, the deputies that are responding, are looking at a screen, and that's what they're basing their response on, is what's going on that computer screen.
If I may ask a question, what do we know already about the training that the dispatch individuals or staff currently get regarding implicit bias? I think, this is really a rather large universe that we're trying to tackle in terms of the types of biases that all of us have, and certainly when it comes to racial and identity profiling, what I would want to know is how would it, what are they getting now, what fits into what they can do, and what models there are even here within California, as Professor Raphael mentioned, in terms of what's LA doing? What is Oakland doing? What are some of these large metropolitan areas doing that do have diverse populations? And can we look to them as a model in terms of their trainings for dispatch officers.
So it was my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, that they were saying that initially they have almost nothing, little to no, with regards to the bias by proxy and all of the other bias-based policing that the officers are getting. If I remember correctly, I think that was actually discussed that they don't get anything at all, and the ones that do receive it, it's not because Post is mandating it. It's because the individual agencies like LAPD that has an enormous call center and they can kind of absorb a lot of that, the dispatchers being gone for training and things like that. But from what I understood, and again, I apologize if I'm incorrect, but I'm pretty sure they said that they don't receive anything as far as something that has to be mandated from Post.
Yeah, that was my, oh, sorry. Oh, that was my recollection as well. Yeah. And in fact, I think that that's what we could recommend, that a course be or a tool or one of the things that struck me from sitting in on their meeting, actually a lot of the dispatchers were quite forthright in talking about it with me, and they were a little concerned that someone would give them a rubric of questions that they'd have to ask of everybody. And everybody was sort of giving me examples of calls where they really had to read the tea leaves as to what was happening. Sometimes people will call and just say something like, "Hey, I'd like to order pizza." That was the one example that stuck with me, when they were actually really in crisis, but they couldn't say anything because people were listening on the phone. And so they, I was struck by just listening to the anecdotes, and they had invited board members to go to listen-alongs, actually, to sit and watch a day dispatching, which would be a pretty fascinating thing to do. But it does seem that the training would be something that would have to be developed, looking to the research, and then also in some kind of coordination with, senior experienced dispatchers.
I may just jump in momentarily. If this is something the subcommittee is interested in making a recommendation on to take to the full board, that's certainly something you all can vote on today, and making a recommendation, of course, that be included in the basic training. Procedurally, we would take public comment and then have a vote on that, if that's something the subcommittee is interested in moving forward on today.
Would be interested in that. Is that, you said, so we would need a motion? Or would that wait until after public comment?
Allison's come to my rescue. She will help me.
Essentially the vote would be to take this to the full board for their consideration, because the subcommittee can recommend to the full board a recommendation they'd like to make to Post or the legislature, or however you all want to frame it. And so we could make, a motion could be made, and then we'd like to take public comment on that before having the final vote. But the vote would essentially be to bring it to the full board for then a full board discussion as part of the meeting on October 20th, since the next board meeting is focused on regulation. So the next full board meeting after that will be October 20th, and we're going to allow time for each of the subcommittees to kind of report out on what they, what they've discussed in the subcommittees, and any recommendations that they'd like the full board to vote on.
Okay, well then I will wait until after public comment to make my motion.
And I think what we can do, and we still have plenty of time for discussion, so I don't want to, you can all make a motion and second it to, have a vote on that after public comment. So if this particular recommendation is one you'd like to move to the full board, you can make the motion now. We just want to make sure we allow the public to weigh in before having you all make the final vote. So you could end a meeting with one recommendation that you've all approved to bring to the board. You could have 5. So it's really, in terms of things like having us research, additional items or things you want to investigate further, that's something you can decide as a subcommittee. But if there are recommendations to post or the legislature, then the full board would need to vote on those.
I'm fine with waiting. I can wait. Maybe something is said in public comment or something that way we don't have to amend the initial motion.
That's great. But just to clarify, you still have significant amount of time. We want to turn, at the latest at 1:40 to public comment. We can of course turn to it before then, but if you all have other aspects that you'd like to discuss, there's plenty of time for that.
Perhaps could we talk a little bit about the crisis response teams? And I'm trying to envision what the model might be for a non-law enforcement response to mental health crises. Would we imagine that going through a Department of Emergency Services as it does in San Francisco? And then again, I guess this all comes back to dispatch. The dispatch would decide, flag something as not requiring a law enforcement response, or Kendall and DOJ staff, did you envision or have you seen models where there's actually a different number to call for a mental health issue that would kind of put it in a different path? And I would imagine that for families of people suffering from mental health issues, that they may be more likely to use such services or only use law enforcement in the most serious situations or what have you. So I'd be curious to hear if there were any thoughts in that with that regard.
Oh, I'll weigh in on that. It's easy for me to say because I'm not a dispatcher, so I'm not the one doing the additional work. But I think it's important, and I think that came up when we were talking about the San Francisco model, is just being able to track the calls and having that CAD number and everything else like that to actually track the successes or the things that were less successful and everything else like that. That's already built into that system. So you can actually, say, hey, we responded to 25 of these calls in a month or 3 calls in a month, but there's already a system in place. You wouldn't have to be reworking a system to keep track of how many calls for service and everything else like that. Plus, most comm centers have the ability to reach out to all the different agencies that would apply to, whether it's a community-based or even a police-based system like we have here in Anaheim. We have it's called PERT, the Psychiatric Emergency Response Team, but they ride with a clinician. They're plain clothes. They're not in uniform. They drive a plain vehicle. There's no markings or anything else like that. But what that allows the clinician is the lead on all of the licensed clinician is the lead on all of those calls. But what that does allow us to do is keep track of where those folks are. So if they do need help, then they're not on an island or they're not trying to call 911 themselves. There's already that set in place where someone knows that location. So if a call for help does go out, they know where to respond. In addition to that, I think it's better to have the CAD system recording each and every one of these calls to keep track of what's going on with them. So that's my 2 cents on it.
Just I'll weigh in the interest of using some time on what Ventura County has, and it's we've had a civilian, if you will, response team for mental health crises in our community for more than 30 years, and it's a full-time team. that sometimes is available, sometimes is not. Just depends on what's going on in the community, and you just never know what's going to happen. And many of those situations that are mental health related and known to be from the beginning often go directly to the crisis team and circumvent public safety. It doesn't go to the fire department, the police, the sheriff. They call the crisis team. Usually it's a family member who recognizes their loved one is in some type of episode, and the crisis team very often handles it, and police are never involved. We also have a hybrid program that's been in place for several years where a therapist, clinician rides with a deputy or two in the community, and primarily works with the homeless community, known mental health consumers in the homeless community, but is also a great resource for those emergency calls that arise that involves someone in mental crisis, where somebody not in a uniform with an advanced level of training can get involved and make a difference. But we've seen great success in training our deputies. We have nearly 100% compliance with crisis intervention team training, and that's been going on in our county for 20 years. And we've seen a precipitous decline in use of force incidents since the implementation of that training. And we've advanced that even to our civilian jail staff as well as our dispatch staff. Some of those principles are similar to what you would see training in for bias, just recognition of those types of incidents and ways in which to intercede so that less harm is done. So I don't know, and I'm anxiously watching these other communities that have implemented civilian response teams for incidents in the community such as domestic violence that are reported to be minor in nature, and other such things that armed police have traditionally responded to. I fear the creation of a second class of police officers in the community where those responses start taking place, and then the recognition is that, hey, we need body armor, and that's not enough. We need pepper spray. We need something else to manage these incidents. So in that sense, I'm a bit skeptical, but certainly curious and open-minded.
I may answer a few of your questions, Dr. Raphael. You had asked about programs using something alternative to 911. So the Sacramento Street, or it's not the Sacramento, sorry, the street crisis response teams in San Francisco, they also rely on the 988 number. So that's going to be a new nationally recognized crisis line that folks can call. That is going to be an alternative to 911. Separately, if I recall correctly, they also utilize the 311 number as an alternative to 911. They were saying, though, in their presentation to us, one of those challenges in moving away completely from the 911 number is actually educating the public on this alternative or this new number that they can call. So I know it's something the street crisis response teams have been looking at in San Francisco, and I believe it's something similar in the Denver STAR program as well. So they are looking at some alternative numbers. Although it's not in this draft report, there are two organizations that I've mentioned, both Mental Health First in Sacramento and Oakland, and CAT 911 in Los Angeles, that do operate completely separately from the 911 number. And they do, I know at least the Mental Health First in Sacramento does respond to domestic violence incidents. So that's one program that is doing that. I'd have to do further research on CAT 911, but I believe they're also responding to those as well.
I wonder, since we have time and we'll have public comment about a motion that we will offer, is it out of practice to perhaps maybe wordsmith what the motion might be ahead of time, and then the public comment can respond?
You can certainly do that. You can certainly do that. We would like to wait to open it up to public comment. You can take public comment now on that if you'd like, or you can wait, have the full discussion, and make sure you have all of the things you'd like to, the public to comment on at the same time, and then have a vote later. Or you're also all welcome to open up just the specific item for public comment before continuing the discussion.
Well, I guess perhaps we should continue just a little longer. Kendall, maybe would it be helpful to see your action items again? It's hard to.
Of course. Does it make sense to start with bias by proxy and then go into the crisis response models?
Sure. And then we can at least make sure that we respond to the issues that you raised.
So I brought up on bias by proxy recommendations for post when it comes to dispatcher training, as well as potentially the post commission developing regulations on training. So we did talk about updating dispatcher training, but we didn't explore yet kind of the ability to work with the post commission and actually developing some regulations. Didn't know if folks had any thoughts on that. That's something folks just want to kind of think about moving forward. But that was something we learned, I believe, during the advisory council meeting. I was wondering if the board had any thoughts on that with regards to developing regulations for trainings.
So just to maybe to be clear, so developing regulations, I apologize for the question, but does that literally mean that we would define the contours of what the training should cover, or who should be consulted, or the process that would go into developing the training?
That's ultimately up to you all. But one observation we were able to make is there's not uniform policies or procedures across the state. And so there's a couple of ways of approaching that. Of course, there's legislative recommendations, but there's also the post commission that develops regulations as well. That was certainly something new I learned from the advisory council meeting. So don't know if the subcommittee has interest in not having, I don't think we're in a position where we have concrete recommendations right now, but looking further into possibly making policy recommendations to create uniform practices, whether that be with post or whether that be a legislative fix.
I can comment to that. I think the post commission would probably be a little more agile or quicker in response to something like that than trying to go the route of the legislatures, who will be out of session, I think September 10th to whenever, and then you have to deal with the internal politics of all that. I think the post commission is probably a better route. Again, that's just my opinion. I think they move a little bit faster on some of these issues than the legislatures would be.
Agreed with that, and I see Post as being interested in this topic, not resistant at all. So I think that's a wise direction to go instead of the roll of the dice with the legislature.
A similar question was regarding the bias flow chart. I believe, Dr. Raphael, you had a comment about the flow chart. Wanted to see if other folks had thoughts, if it's something effective, or maybe we need to spend some more time developing, since it might be a tool both for law enforcement and for someone before calling 911. I didn't know if anyone else had any further thoughts on that, regarding that flow chart.
I mean, I personally think tools can be very useful, but uh, I think though they would have to be populated with with actual useful signals of bias by proxy. So I think it would be hard for us a priori to just say if X, Y, without actually having someone analyze the content of calls, or perhaps even knowing that there are outcomes that or sort of calls for service that one could flag as potentially biased, and then trying to look at the content of the underlying call that generated the call for service. I don't know if that research base exists or if that knowledge base exists, or maybe if there would be an adjacent body of knowledge on implicit bias and other sort of law enforcement situations that could be used to flag signals of a potential bias caller. So I'm thinking about the work that the Stanford team has done over the last few years in Oakland and other places. It might be a little far afield from what they were doing because they look specifically at the linguistics of interactions between law enforcement and the public. But my guess would be that they'd have some opinions about where one might start to look for, some sort of cue or clue. And I guess the other issue I wonder is, what would be the way that, and I imagine this is something that Post would have to develop, but what would be the way that we'd or dispatchers would be advised to use this information? Would it be or uncover the information? Is it simply to passively listen and try to infer cues from what's being told, or are there specific questions that maybe could be strategically asked to try to uncover the motivation or the potential thinking of the caller? In theory, it looks good to me. In practice, I find it hard to offer comment in terms of content because
No, I appreciate your comments, and certainly we'll look into the Stanford research as well. Kind of the idea with the flow chart wasn't more so for dispatch as it was for something for the public to look at prior to calling 911, but also for officers to consider prior to initiating a stop. So it kind of has that dual lens. I actually hadn't thought of it in terms of dispatchers, just because we had heard pretty consistently that a script may be problematic in trying to field some of these calls. I don't want to take us away from this topic if folks have more comment on it, but did have a few more questions regarding crisis response. Does anyone have anything else on the bias by proxy you'd like to discuss? Just to clarify, regarding making a recommendation to post on the scope of on regulations, it would be the scope of the regulations to actually standardize bias. Is the thought about back up? So with the recommendation in developing dispatching policies or regulations, I know we had talked about making one recommendation to post regarding dispatcher trainings to include bias. And kind of separately, I had asked making recommendations to the Post Commission about creating uniform policies regarding dispatch. And so just wanted to clarify on the second one, is the way I'm phrasing it what you were thinking of? I don't want, I just want to make sure I'm capturing what the subcommittee's thoughts were on this.
And speak to that, I would say both. I would say one, some sort of standardized protocol similar to, a post certificate is good from, Eureka all the way down to San Ysidro. So the same thing should apply to dispatch. Being a qualified dispatcher shouldn't be that far off from, again, a larger city versus a smaller city. And then in addition to that, recommending that the post training for the bias by proxy and things like that should be incorporated into the standard training.
Perhaps might it be worthwhile to make and I don't want to be the professor suggesting research, but that's what I'm going to do. Given that DOJ internally does have the narrative fields from RIPA stops, might it be possible to use the content of those to, I imagine one could think of calls for service that are not resulting in arrest, that are not resulting in citation. And is there any information in those fields that might be used to code a stop that you might think of as bias by proxy? And if one could come up with such a schema, then you have an outcome to analyze, which would be, these are perhaps stops that we consider to be worthy of further examination. And then we could find aspects or characteristics that might be predictive of that kind of stop. So it's just a suggestion maybe to use the data a little bit more intensively with what exists.
Dr. Raphael, I think that's an excellent idea. As far as feasibility for this year, I don't know how deep of a dive we can take into this, but there's certainly, even without looking at a narrative field, a way to look at, one, is it in response to a call for service, and two, if no action was taken, and then and look at those disparities, if any we see there. And then, of course, that additional layer of looking at that narrative field. That's certainly something that's available to us. Feasibility-wise, I don't know logistically if we're going to have the people power to make that happen this year, but I think that's an excellent idea.
Perhaps a longer-term aspiration. Yeah.
I just have a few more questions, and I do want to leave enough time for the subcommittee to do some wordsmithing, because it does sound like folks have two kind of different recommendations. So I want to give you all time to discuss that as well. But just wanted to circle back on the crisis response. Does the board have interest in taking a look at the programs like Mental Health First and CAT 911? Just kind of a preliminary look this year about how they're responding to those calls, like domestic violence calls. And then similarly, are there any fundamental principles to crisis response that you all have learned in your experiences in law enforcement or otherwise that maybe we should be including here that aren't already there?
Well, I think my concern would be whether you're looking at this as, is it a crime or not? I think there's a difference between responding to something that's not a crime in progress versus something domestic violence as a broad term. So I think is I think that's where I kind of change my position as to does law enforcement need to respond? I would say that if it's not a crime, no, law enforcement doesn't. But that's to me, that's kind of a pretty gray area to say that a domestic violence call shouldn't involve law enforcement because there's the victim side of that, and I think I don't want to get too far off from not responding to things that may result in an arrest or something like that.
I may have been unclear. Are folks interested in exploring programs like Mental Health First and the CAT teams that are looking at alternatives to responses beyond mental health crises? And not necessarily a policy recommendation one way or another, but are folks interested in exploring those a little bit further?
Would that mean inviting representatives to tell us about their program or to ask researchers who maybe have evaluated them what the findings are? I mean, learning about certainly.
Probably for this year, I don't anticipate we're going to have many more subcommittee meetings with the timing of the draft report, but it's certainly something we could invite folks to come and speak to next year. And we could do a preliminary write-up, kind of like we did last year with the San Francisco Street Crisis Response Team. We did a preliminary write-up on how the program began, and then this year we invited the program to actually come and speak to the board, as well as share some lessons learned.
I guess, Kendall, just to ask a further question, are we doubling down on, I don't mean it that way, but on looking even deeper in mental health response, or we're kind of expanding the scope towards other emergency responses? I mean, personally, I'd be curious to hear back from the Department of Emergency Management at San Francisco, because when we had talked to them, they seemed to just be getting rolling and they were going to expand it citywide, and it sounded like it was going to, be brought to scale. And it would be interesting to hear about their experience with that, or even to hear the experience in Sheriff Ives County as well with their programs, to get some sense of the different approaches counties are taking and what works and where the challenges are. Obviously this is a huge problem, and it hasn't been solved, and we could always learn more.
I agree completely. I mentioned in my comments earlier that that the idea is fascinating. It's a departure from traditional emergency response, if you will, in the community. And if there's a better way to do it, I think we're all interested in seeing things done better. So in that sense, I'm very interested in learning and studying what works other places that we could take and adopt here and other places to take our police officers out of those situations that they could be said to escalate, or that could result in a use of force incident by just by the mere presence of an armed police officer showing up. So, and I'd be happy to report out on anything that we're doing locally, or any connections I can make to other counties that are doing progressive leaning ideas on management of policing in their communities.
I certainly appreciate everyone's feedback, and want to kind of open it up again if there's anything else the board has questions for that I can help answer today, or if it makes sense to working on the motions that have been discussed earlier. It is about 1:15. We do have, I believe it's 15 minutes set aside for public comment. So I will leave that up to you all. If you have any questions for me, I'm more than happy to answer them. If not, if there's no more board discussion on these particular topics, it may make sense to discussing proposed recommendations at this time.
That sounds good to me. Well, do we want to discuss the content of a motion, or should we hear public comment first?
The comment first. That way, if there is something, we won't have to amend any motions.
Fantastic. I'm going to ask Allison to help me out a little bit with public comment, and we'll go ahead and get that started. It looks like we have a few folks who have their hands raised.
Yes, excuse me, I'm going to cough for 1 second. Okay, so for public comment, what we usually do, I see Michelle, you have your hand raised. So let's, we can take Michelle's comment first, and then why don't we go, you know, by region and see if there are other public comments. So for those of you who would like to give public comment, feel free, if you go to the people sort of icon at the top and then you scroll all the way to the bottom to raise hand, feel free to raise your hand if you would like to give public comment, or when we go through the regions, you know, feel free to just unmute yourself, and feel free to, when you are giving public comment, to unmute your video and your audio. So Michelle, why don't we start with you?
Great, thank you so much. Are you able to hear me and see me? Great, okay. My name is Michelle Wittig, and I'm with the Santa Monica Coalition for Police Reform. My comment relates to both the bias by proxy topic and the crisis response topic. What I've observed and actually experienced is that there can be a bias of a total interaction between an unbiased caller, an unbiased dispatcher, and an unbiased officer responder. In other words, none of these individuals have acted with bias, but the combination of the three results in a biased response. So here's an example taken from my own experience. I'm driving back from the Community Police Academy in Santa Monica. It's 9 o'clock at night, and I'm driving home. It's dark. I come up on a blind off-ramp on the 10 freeway, and I see a petite African-American woman in the dark struggling to get her very full shopping cart, which looks like it's full of her belongings, not groceries. It's deserted, and she's trying so hard to pull that shopping cart out of the street and up that curb. And she's saying, "Help me, help me." So I turned the corner and I pulled over to where it was safe, and I called 911 and I described what was happening to the dispatcher. Then I drove on home. Later, I took a look at the result in the list of calls for service for my local police department, and I had a kind of caller's remorse because the result fell far short of what I had hoped. This person was cited not for needing help, not for being in need of a response to assist her to get safe, but she was cited for disturbing the peace. So I would say that I wasn't biased in calling 911. The dispatcher wasn't biased in sending out an officer, and the officer probably wasn't biased either. Maybe the officer had very little latitude with respect to what he or she could have done in that situation. So maybe there's a way for this report to suggest that there may be bias at the intersection of these three things, even though they don't reside in the individuals themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Checking. Don't see any other raised hands. So why don't we go to any other public comment in Southern California? No comments, and oh, I see Mr. Hilton has raised your hand. Mr. Hilton, please feel free to unmute your video and audio and give your comment. Thank you.
We have all been here before. We were here almost 3 years ago, and these discussions are, as my friend Yogi Berra said, like deja vu all over again. The bias by proxy flag points us to the narrative flag, and within that we can find the sentiments of not only the person who made the call, but also the officer who handled it. And we're discussing this as though it is something new. It is not. It is a waste of everyone's time, and I'd like us to stop it. Now, but before we stop it, let us make the narrative files or the narrative fields available to people like me who can make use of them. I have an AI engine available to me that has more power than people, and they can evaluate the sentiments, meaning the engine, it can evaluate the sentiments that are contained within the narrative fields. But the California Department of Justice has decided, contrary to law, contrary to what the Department of Justice itself says, it has refused to make those fields available on the weak, useless claim that these fields may contain, I'm speaking of narrative fields now, may contain officer information, officer identifying information, and personal identifying information. This, despite the fact that under California law, at least 60% of the stop records will require disclosure of OII and PII if the person was either cited or arrested. In other words, the position of the California Department of Justice is unsupported by anything, and that disturbs me and perplexes me and annoys me. These discussions are wasting my time and your time and the public's time, and they ought to stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hilton. Are there any other public comments from Southern California? We'll move to Central California. Are there any public comments from Central California? Any public comments from Northern California? anyone else like to make a public comment before we close the public comment period? Okay, not hearing any. I think we have completed our public comment period. We can move to next steps. So if you all would like to craft as part of next steps, if you'd like to craft the recommendations that you all would like to make and that you would basically like to move on in order for consideration by the full board, and proceed with that now.
Okay, well, I am far from a wordsmith, so wordsmithing I will leave to Dr. Raphael. I am far from that. So I would like two motions. My first motion would be to recommend some sort of standardized operating procedure for dispatch, and whether that be through post or through legislation, that I would like to make that recommendation.
Maybe to build on it a little bit, Edgar, as a friendly amendment, could we recommend that post, in coordination with dispatch professionals, develop a training and series of guidelines for how to identify and flag calls that perhaps represent bias by proxy calls? Is that too specific?
That sounds good to me, sir.
But still open to discussion. We could not making a motion yet, but just trying to think about a motion that we could put on the table.
I'm trying to understand Dr. Raphael's motion. Would that be a flagging of a biased by proxy call that someone actually responds to, or just something that's phoned into a communication center?
Well, I would be personally a little cautious about making a really specific recommendation that it be responded to or not responded to, just based on what I heard from the dispatchers. But if we can somehow, or if Post can figure out a way to train dispatchers to recognize that bias may be a factor in this call and flag it, and I'm just thinking back about Edgar's earlier comments about what's on the screen and what officers are responding to. If that information was available, and how it's used, whether it's to change priority or to not take the call, or I think that would, be up to others to think through. But we can certainly make a recommendation that investigation and training and procedure be developed and communicated statewide or required statewide.
I'm supportive of the idea. Do we need to restate it as a motion? Allison or Kendall?
Yes, so you would all have to make a motion to make this recommendation to the full board at the board meeting. And so, yes, you would have to make a motion, and then you have to have a second and a roll call vote.
Okay, I'll try to make a motion, and we'll see how it works. And then, which can be friendly amended, I guess, right? I understand the rules correctly. So I am making a motion that the board recommend that POST develop in conjunction with experienced dispatchers and researchers knowledgeable on explicit and implicit bias, a training that would help dispatchers recognize calls that may represent bias by proxy calls, with the aim of communicating that to officers. Well, maybe we'll just stop there and not add anything else.
I will second that motion.
Okay, so why don't we take a vote on that? So Sheriff Ayub,
I vote aye.
Manju Kulkarni, she may have stepped away. So we'll go to everyone else and then go back. So Member Hampton,
Aye.
Member Raphael,
Aye.
and Member Kulkarni, you are there. She may have stepped away, but since we still have a quorum, the motion carries, and so we will work with the co-chairs to bring that to the full board in October. Are there any other motions that you all would like to make? Does that encompass?
For me.
Just to help jog folks' memories, one of the second things we discussed was uniform trainings, and then the other thing we had been discussing was uniform dispatch policies or regulations. So, for example, those CAD codes are different depending on the agency. So don't know if the board or the subcommittee is at a place to make recommendations post consult with experts and evidence-based researchers on developing regulations for uniform policies across dispatch agencies. But ultimately, that's up to you all. I just wanted to make sure I flagged that for folks.
Well, I will go ahead and make that motion for some sort of, or at least a recommendation. My motion will be to recommend to POST to have some sort of uniformed training, reference their responses to those calls for service that we discussed earlier.
Is there a second? See, okay, great. So we will have a vote on that motion then. Member Ayub.
Aye.
Member Raphael. That was I. Sorry. Okay, great. Member Hampton.
Aye.
And Member Kulkarni, if you are available.
What's up, buddy?
Okay, not hearing anything. The motion carries. We do have a quorum, so that motion will carry as well. Yes. Okay, so we have two recommendations that we are carrying forward to the board. I just want to, we still do have a little bit of time, so if there's any other motions that you all would like to make for any further recommendations, you can do that now as well.
I'm good.
If you all would like to open for any additional public comments, you're welcome to do that if you would like. I see some nods. We do still have a little bit of time, so if there's any additional public comment, if you'd like to open that for that, we can do that as well. I see Mr. Hilton, if you'd like to give a public comment, please do so. And when he is finished, if anyone else on the team, if anyone else on the call would like to make a public comment, feel free to use the raise hand function, which is at the very bottom of the column for the people icon, or you can unmute yourself. So Mr. Hilton, please go ahead.
Thank you. I think there is and continues to be, and it is quite disturbing that it continues, the notion that people who are homeless have no protections of the law. There has been a discussion of a person who was on an off-ramp who needed help as they struggled up the ramp, and a police officer turned up to make a check on the difficulty that they experienced, and then in turn wrote a record that shows the woman had disturbed the peace. I lay all of that at the feet of the California Department of Justice. The California Department of Justice requires that interactions with homeless people be coded in two ways. The second is most important, and it is officer observed the commission of a crime. A woman struggling up a freeway ramp commits no crimes, but the CADOJ requires it, and I hold the CADOJ responsible. And there is nothing, no protestations or denials that can change that. But the CADOJ can and should the next round of regulations that go out. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hilton. And for everybody's information, we are, and just as a reminder, we are having a board meeting on September 1st from 3 to 5:15 p.m., followed by a public hearing on the proposed changes to the regulations. And the public hearing following the board meeting is from 6 to 8 on September 1st as well. So everyone is welcome to join those and provide their comments on the proposed regulation changes. Is there anyone else who would like to make a public comment? Not hearing any others. If there are any final next steps from any of the subcommittee members, anything else that anyone would like to address?
I think I personally on this subcommittee found the presentations by the providers and the ability to talk to dispatchers to be very informative. And I'd love to hear, and again, this could be next year, but to hear back from San Francisco, to hear from other counties, and maybe, we can have a little bit of a forum to think about good ideas and or things that people have tried that haven't worked. And air them in the public. I think that would be a healthy thing, especially when it comes to mental health response.
And I think we can certainly, work on putting that together and consulting with the co-chairs on that one. Well, if there's nothing else, then co-chairs, you can close out the meeting. Great. Well, thanks everyone.
You guys have a good afternoon.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.